The shed is perfectly fine for someone your age. My daughter-in-law Jessica said this while sipping her morning latte in what used to be my kitchen. I smiled, nodded, and continued sweeping the dirt floor of the converted tool shed they'd relegated. Me too. What she didn't know was that by next week, she'd be staring at a sold sign in the front yard, frantically calling me to beg for somewhere to live. Before we dive into this story, don't forget to hit that like button, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this unfolds. My name is Rose Mitchell. I'm 70 years old, and until 18 months ago, I owned the most beautiful 15-acre property in Millbrook County, complete with a sprawling farmhouse that had been in my family for 3 generations. But this story really begins 2 years ago, when my world shifted in ways I never saw coming. When my husband Frank passed away from a sudden heart attack at the age of 72, I thought the hardest part would be learning to live alone in our big house. We'd been married for 48 years, and Frank had always handled the business side of our small organic farm, the contracts with local restaurants, the seasonal workers, the equipment maintenance, and all the financial planning. I'd focused on what I loved most, the gardens, keeping our books, and managing our successful bed and breakfast operation that brought city folks seeking a peaceful weekend retreat. I was 68 years old when Frank died, and I'd never lived anywhere. But this property. We'd bought it when we were young newlyweds in 1976, spending every spare dollar and weekend for the next 45 years building it into something truly special. The farmhouse itself was a classic 2-story Victorian that we'd painstakingly restored, complete with wraparound porches, original hardwood floors that gleamed like honey, high ceilings with intricate crown molding, and enough bedrooms to house our B&B guests comfortably. Over the decades, we'd modernized everything while preserving the historic charm. Updated plumbing and electrical systems, a gourmet kitchen with commercial-grade appliances for the B&B, central air conditioning that was a godsend during humid summers, and surprisingly good high-speed internet that reached even our rural location. Frank had insisted on solar panels in 2015, making us almost entirely energy independent. The house was a perfect blend of old-world elegance and modern convenience. But more than the buildings, it was the land that made this place truly magical. 15 acres of gently rolling hills with a clear creek meandering through the back. Pasture where Frank used to sit and fish on Sunday afternoons. Ancient oak trees provided shade so deep you could escape the hottest summer day beneath their canopy. The soil was rich, black earth that had been carefully tended for generations. Everything we planted seemed to grow with an enthusiasm that bordered on the supernatural. We had established vegetable gardens that supplied our kitchen and several local restaurants with organic produce. Fruit orchards produced apples, pears, and peaches that people drove from 3 counties over to buy. Flower beds attracted butterflies, hummingbirds, and bees in numbers that made the property feel alive, with movement and color. A renovated barn housed our small flock of heritage chickens, 2 gentle goats that the B&B guests loved to visit, and enough space for Frank's workshop where he'd built most of our furniture by hand. The property was worth a fortune, I knew, that much, even though Frank and I had never cared about the money. Over the years, developers had made increasingly aggressive offers, wanting to subdivide our land for luxury homes or shopping centers. The most recent offer, just before Frank died, had been for $3.2 million. We'd always refused without even considering it. This wasn't just real estate to us. It was our legacy, our piece of heaven, the place where we'd raised our son Marcus and where we'd planned to grow old together, eventually passing it down to our family. The B&B operation had become surprisingly successful over the years. We called it Meadowbrook Farmstay, and during peak season, spring through fall, we were booked solid most weekends. City people paid premium rates to stay in our beautifully appointed guest rooms, eat breakfasts made from ingredients, grown on the property, and experience what they called authentic country living. Frank used to joke that we were selling them the life we lived every day, but they were happy to pay for it and we were happy to share it. After Frank died, I'll admit I struggled with loneliness. The house felt enormous and too quiet without his presence. I missed our morning coffee conversations on the front porch, the way he'd hum while working in his shop, his terrible jokes that still made me laugh after all those years. The grief was heavy and persistent, like carrying a weight I couldn't put down. But I never, not even for a moment, struggled with managing the property itself. I was stronger and more capable than people gave me credit for. I'd always been an equal partner in everything we'd built, not just the pretty face who arranged flowers while Frank did the real work. I knew every inch of this land, every quirk of every system in the house, every guest's preferences and every supplier's schedule. I kept the gardens not just maintained but thriving, expanding the herb garden and starting a cutting garden that produced gorgeous bouquets for the guest rooms. I managed the B&B bookings through our website, handled customer service with a personal touch that had our repeat guests feeling like family, and maintained the 5-star rating that kept us booked. Solid. I even taught myself to fix the temperamental water pump that Frank had always cursed at, watched YouTube videos to learn basic electrical repairs, and figured out how to operate the commercial dishwasher when it started acting up. The financial side turned out to be much easier than I'd expected. Frank had been more successful than either of us realized, quietly setting aside money for years while living modestly. Our B&B income was substantial. During peak season, we brought in nearly $4,000 per weekend, and even off-season bookings were steady. The organic produce we sold to upscale restaurants in the city provided reliable monthly income. Frank's life insurance policy was generous, and our savings account was healthier than I'd known, enough that I could live very comfortably without touching the principal. I was managing just fine on my own, thank you very much. Better than fine, actually. I was discovering parts of myself that had been dormant while Frank was alive. I was more independent, more confident in my decision-making, more willing to try new things. I'd started taking watercolor classes in town, joined a book club, and even begun dating a lovely widower named Harold who appreciated both my cooking and my conversation. But apparently, my son Marcus and his wife Jessica had very different ideas about what a 68-year-old widow was capable of handling. Marcus was 45, our only child, and someone I'd raised to be thoughtful and kind. He'd always been a good son, dutiful, responsible, the kind of man who called his mother every Sunday and remembered birthdays without being reminded. He worked as a financial advisor in the city, lived in a nice suburban house with Jessica and their 2 teenage children, and seemed to have built a comfortable middle-class life. Jessica was 42, a real estate agent who specialized in luxury properties, and someone I'd never quite warmed to in the 15 years since she and Marcus got married. She was perfectly polite, always well-dressed, and said all the right things at family gatherings. But there was something calculating about her that made me uncomfortable. She had a way of evaluating everything: houses, cars, jewelry, even people, with the practiced eye of someone always assessing value and potential profit. Their monthly visits had started innocently enough after Frank's funeral. "Just checking on Mom," Marcus would say, bringing Jessica and sometimes the kids for Sunday dinner. But I began to notice that these visits had taken on a different quality. They weren't coming to spend time with me or enjoy the beauty of the property. They were conducting inspections. "Mom, this place is too much for you," Marcus said during one of these visits, gesturing around the farmhouse kitchen where I was canning tomatoes from my latest harvest. The kitchen counter was covered with mason jars, filled with bright red preserves, the smell of herbs and garlic filling the air. "You can't keep up with 15 acres and a business operation. It's not safe for you to be out here alone." I looked up from the boiling water bath where I was processing the jars, wiping my hands on my apron. "I'm managing perfectly well, Marcus. The B&B is booked through next spring. The gardens are producing better than they have in years, and I've got reliable help with anything too heavy for me to handle alone." Jessica, who'd been scrolling through her phone at my kitchen table, the same table where Frank and I had shared thousands of meals, looked up with that patronizing smile I'd learned to dread. It was the smile she used with difficult clients, the one that said she was being patient with someone who didn't understand the obvious. "Rose, we're not questioning your abilities," she said in the tone people use with small children. "We're just worried about you. What if something happened? What if you fell or had a medical emergency? It would take an ambulance at least 20 minutes to get out here, maybe longer depending on traffic." "I have a cell phone that works perfectly well," I replied, continuing to pack tomatoes into jars with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Henderson from the next property checks on me every day when she walks her dog. Tom Bradley from Bradley Farm helps. Me with the heavy equipment maintenance and anything else I can't handle myself. The UPS driver knows to check if he doesn't see me around the usual time. I'm hardly isolated." Marcus and Jessica exchanged one of their looks, the kind of wordless, marital communication that excluded me from my own conversation. I'd seen this look before, and it always preceded some new suggestion about how I should be living my life. "Mom, we've been talking," Marcus said carefully, settling into Frank's old chair at the head of the table. The chair where my husband had read his morning paper for 45 years, where he'd helped Marcus with homework, where he'd planned our days and dreams. Seeing Marcus sitting there, but with Jessica's agenda behind his words, made something twist painfully in my chest. "We think it would be better if you moved closer to town," he continued. "Somewhere smaller, easier to manage. There are some really nice senior communities these days." "I'm not moving to a senior community," I interrupted, setting down my canning ladle with more force than necessary. "This is my home, Marcus. Your father and I built this life together over nearly 50 years. I'm not giving it up because you think I'm too old to handle it." "But Mom," Jessica chimed in, leaning forward with what she probably thought was a concerned expression. "Think about it practically. You could sell this place for millions, probably close to 4 million in today's market. Think of how comfortable you could be with that kind of money. No more worrying about property maintenance. No more being tied down to a business operation. No more isolation." That's when the real motivation behind these conversations became crystal clear. This wasn't about my safety, my comfort, or my well-being. This was about my money, my property, the legacy that Frank and I had spent our lives building, drop by drop, board by board, season by season. "And I suppose you two have thoughts about what I should do with all that money from selling my home?" I asked quietly, continuing to work but watching their faces carefully. Marcus had the grace to look embarrassed, his face reddening slightly as he realized how transparent their motives had become. But Jessica pressed on with the determination of someone who'd already convinced herself that her desires were perfectly reasonable. "Well, obviously we'd want to help you manage it," she said smoothly. "Marcus has extensive experience with financial planning and investment strategies. We could help you find a place that would really suit your needs at this stage of life, make sure your money is working for you, that kind of thing." I looked at my son, this man I'd carried for 9 months, raised through scraped knees and broken hearts, put through college by working double shifts at the local diner, celebrated with at his wedding and the births of his children. I tried to see in his face some trace of the boy who'd helped me plant seedlings in these gardens, who'd named all our chickens and cried when predators got them, who'd promised at his father's funeral that he'd always take care of me. Instead, I saw a middle-aged man who'd stopped seeing this place as his family's heritage and started seeing it as his inheritance. Worse, he'd married a woman who saw it as her retirement plan. "I'm not selling," I said firmly, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made final decisions about her own life for 7 decades. "This is my home, and I'm staying here." The visits became more frequent after that conversation, and the pressure more intense and less subtle. They'd arrive with real estate brochures featuring sprawling luxury homes that could be bought with the proceeds from selling my property. They brought printouts of senior living facilities with amenities like pools and activity centers, as if I were a child who could be distracted by shiny objects. They carried increasingly dire warnings about the dangers of living alone, statistics about elderly accidents, and horror stories about other widows who'd waited too long to make practical decisions. "Mom, what happens when you can't climb these stairs anymore?" Jessica would ask, while pointedly looking at the polished wooden staircase that led to the second floor, the same stairs I'd been climbing effortlessly for 45 years. "What happens when the roof needs replacing and you can't afford the repairs?" Marcus would add, conveniently ignoring the fact that I had plenty of money and the roof had been professionally inspected and updated just 3 years earlier. "What happens when you have a medical emergency and there's no one here to help you?" They'd ask in unison, like they'd rehearsed this particular argument. But what really bothered me wasn't their stated concern for my well-being. It was the way they'd started talking about and treating the property like it was already theirs. Jessica would walk through the rooms with the calculating eye of someone planning renovations, making comments about how the kitchen could be updated with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, how the master bedroom would be perfect for them once they moved in, how they could convert the B&B guest rooms into home offices or entertainment spaces for their friends. Marcus would stand in the barn making plans for what kind of equipment they'd need if they decided to continue farming, or discussing how much they could get for the land if they sold it to developers who were constantly circling like vultures. They'd have these conversations while I was standing right there, as if I'd already died or moved away, as if my opinion didn't matter because I was just an old woman who couldn't see the bigger picture. The absolute breaking point came 6 months after these pressure campaigns had started, when they arrived one crisp October morning with a folder full of papers and the kind of serious, determined expressions people wear when they're about to deliver an ultimatum. "Mom," Marcus said, settling into Frank's chair with an air of authority that made my blood pressure spike. "We need to have a serious conversation about your future." I poured myself a cup of coffee from the pot I'd been drinking from for decades, sat down across from them at my own kitchen table, and noted how Jessica had spread papers out like she was conducting a hostile business takeover in my own home. "We've been doing extensive research," Jessica began, her voice taking on the professional tone she used with real estate clients. "And we think we've found the perfect solution that addresses everyone's concerns." She slid a glossy brochure across the table toward me. It showed a modern apartment complex with manicured landscaping and a sign reading, "Golden Years Independent Living Community." "It's only 15 minutes from our house," Marcus added quickly, like proximity to them was some kind of selling point. "You'd have your own apartment, 1 bedroom, 1 bath, perfectly sized for your needs. But there's a community dining room where you can eat with other people your age, activities planned every day like crafts and movie nights, and medical staff on site 24 hours a day if you need anything." I stared at the brochure, feeling something cold and heavy settle in my stomach. The apartments looked like hotel rooms. The community areas looked like waiting rooms. The residents in the photos all looked like they were posing for a funeral. Home advertisement. "You want me to move to an old folks' home?" I said flatly. "It's not an old folks' home," Jessica said with exaggerated patience, the same tone she'd used to explain basic concepts to a confused child. "It's independent living for active seniors. You'd have your own space and complete autonomy, but with built-in community support and medical supervision." "And what happens to my property?" Another one of those loaded looks passed between them, the kind that confirmed they'd discussed this scenario extensively when I wasn't around. "Well," Marcus said slowly, trying to sound casual about what was obviously a carefully planned proposal, "we could move in here temporarily, just to take care of the place while it's on the market. Make sure everything's properly maintained, handle the B&B bookings during the transition, coordinate with real estate agents, that kind of thing. You want to sell my home. Mom, we want you to be practical about your situation," Jessica said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who'd been building up to this moment for months. "This place is worth at least $3 million, probably closer to $4 million in today's market. You could live very comfortably on that money for the rest of your life, without any of the stress, responsibility, or physical demands of maintaining a property this size. I set down my coffee cup very carefully, the way you do when you're trying not to throw it across the room. And if I refuse? Marcus looked uncomfortable, but Jessica leaned back with the kind of cold determination I was beginning to recognize as her natural state when she didn't get what she wanted. "Rose, we're not trying to force you into anything," she said with the practiced insincerity of someone who was absolutely trying to force me into something. "But we are trying to help you see reason. You're 70 years old, living alone on a huge property, running a business that requires constant physical work and attention to detail. Something is going to happen. It's not a matter of if, it's when. And when it does, we're going to be the ones who have to clean up the mess, handle the crisis, and deal with all the consequences of your stubbornness. So, this is about protecting yourselves from future inconvenience? This is about protecting you from your own inability to face reality," Jessica shot back, her mask of politeness finally slipping to reveal the irritation underneath. Then she caught herself, took a breath, and softened her tone. "We love you, Rose. We want what's best for you, but we also have to think about practical realities and what's sustainable long-term." I looked at my son, searching his face for some sign of the boy who'd helped me plant vegetable seeds in these gardens every spring, who'd insisted on naming all our chickens and had cried when predators got them, who'd stood beside Frank's grave and promised with tears in his eyes that he'd always take care of me. "Marcus," I said quietly, "what do you think your father would say about this conversation?" He couldn't meet my eyes, looking instead at his hands folded on the table. "Dad would want you to be safe and happy. Your father spent 45 years of his life building this place with me, board by board, garden by garden, dream by dream. He'd want me to hold on to it, to preserve what we created together, to pass it down to our family the way his parents passed their farm down to us. Mom, Dad's gone," Marcus said with a dismissive tone that shocked me with its callousness. "Holding on to the past isn't going to bring him back. At some point, you have to accept reality and make decisions based on what's practical for your future, not what's sentimental about your past." The casual dismissal of everything Frank and I had built together, everything we'd worked for, everything we'd dreamed of preserving for our family, it hit me like a physical blow to the chest. This wasn't just about property or money. This was about erasing the life Frank and I had shared, treating our 48 years of marriage and partnership like it was just holding on to the past. But I didn't argue anymore. I just nodded slowly and said I'd think about their suggestions, because I'd learned something crucial in that conversation. My son and daughter-in-law weren't trying to help me. They were trying to manage me like I was an inconvenient obstacle, standing between them and a valuable piece of real estate. They saw me as a problem to be solved, not a person to be respected, and they had seriously underestimated who they were dealing with. What happened next was something I never could have predicted, not even in my worst nightmares about how low my own family might sink. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the month that followed that kitchen table ultimatum, because it was during those 4 weeks that I learned exactly what Marcus and Jessica were capable of when they didn't get their way. For the first week after our serious conversation, they left me alone. I actually thought maybe they'd heard something in my voice, seen something in my expression that made them realize I wasn't going to be pushed around. I went about my normal routines, tending the gardens as autumn settled in, hosting my weekend B&B guests, preserving the last of the season's harvest, and almost convinced myself that the worst was over. I was wrong. The campaign that followed was so systematic, so calculated, that I realized they must have been planning it for months. It started with small things that I might have dismissed as coincidences if there hadn't been so many of them in such quick succession. My internet service suddenly became unreliable. The company claimed there were issues with the rural infrastructure, but couldn't give me a timeline for repairs. This was particularly problematic because I managed all my B&B bookings online, communicated with guests through email, and used digital payment systems for most of my business transactions. When I called to complain, I was told that upgrading service to my remote location would require a substantial installation fee and couldn't be scheduled for several weeks. Then my landline started having problems. Calls would drop randomly, static, would interrupt conversations, and sometimes the line would be completely dead for hours at a time. The phone company sent a technician who claimed the problem was with aging infrastructure and that replacing the lines to my property would be expensive and time-consuming. My electricity began experiencing frequent outages that seemed to affect only my property. The power company explained that my section of the grid was particularly vulnerable because of my isolated location, and that installing backup systems or improving reliability would require significant investment. Each of these service disruptions was explained with technical language and bureaucratic policies that sounded plausible on the surface. But when they all happened within 2 weeks of each other, to someone who'd had reliable utilities for 45 years, the pattern was obvious. Marcus worked for a financial services company that had corporate accounts with all the major utility providers. Jessica had real estate connections who knew exactly which bureaucratic strings to pull to create temporary service issues. They were systematically making my life difficult, creating exactly the kinds of problems they'd warned me about, so they could point to them as evidence that I couldn't handle living alone. But the utility sabotage was just the beginning. My regular contractor, Tom Bradley, who'd been helping with property maintenance for over a decade, suddenly informed me that he couldn't continue our arrangement. He was uncomfortable and clearly embarrassed when he delivered the news, standing in my driveway with his hat in his hands like a teenager breaking up with his first girlfriend. "I'm real sorry, Mrs. Mitchell," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "But I've got to focus on some bigger commercial contracts that just came up. I won't have time for the smaller residential jobs anymore." I'd known Tom since he was a boy working summers for his father's construction business. I'd watched him build his own company, recommended him to other property owners, and considered him almost like family. The idea that he was dropping me for bigger contracts was absurd. My property provided him with steady year-round work, and I paid promptly and generously. "Tom," I said gently, "what's really going on here?" He shifted uncomfortably, looking everywhere except at my face. "It's just business, Mrs. Mitchell, nothing personal." "Is someone paying you more money to stop working for me?" His face flushed red, and I had my answer. "Tom, how long have we known each other?" "Since I was 12 years old, Mrs. Mitchell." "And in all that time, have I ever been anything but fair and honest with you?" "No, ma'am. You've been nothing but good to me and my family." "Then please do me the courtesy of being honest with me now. What did they offer you?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his boots. Finally, he looked up with misery written all over his face. "Mrs. Mitchell, they offered me the contract to renovate their whole house, plus some commercial properties Jessica's got listed. It's more work than I usually see in a year, and with my youngest starting college next fall." He trailed off, but I understood. "They told you that if you kept working for me, you wouldn't get those contracts." He nodded miserably. "It's okay. Tom, I understand. You have to do what's best for your family." The relief on his face was painful to see. "Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell. I'm real sorry about this." After he left, I sat on my front porch and tried to process what had just happened. My own son had essentially bribed my contractor to abandon me, creating exactly the kind of maintenance crisis they'd been warning me about. They were manufacturing the problems they claimed to be protecting me from. But Tom's defection was just the beginning of the systematic isolation campaign. Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor who'd been checking on me daily, suddenly stopped coming. When I called to make sure she was all right, she was evasive and uncomfortable. "Oh, Rose dear, I'm fine. It's just that my arthritis has been acting up, and the walk over to your place is getting to be too much for these old bones." Mrs. Henderson was 75 years old and had been walking 3 miles every morning for the past decade. The quarter-mile walk to my house had never been a problem before. My usual grocery delivery service called to inform me that they could no longer accommodate rural deliveries due to route optimization. The farmers' market vendors who'd been buying my organic produce suddenly found other suppliers. Even my mail delivery became sporadic, with important letters and packages mysteriously delayed or misplaced. Each incident in isolation might have been explainable. Together, they painted a clear picture of a coordinated campaign to make my independent life as difficult as possible. But the final straw, the incident that made me realize just how far Marcus and Jessica were willing to go, happened 3 weeks after our kitchen table confrontation. I woke up one morning to find that my water wasn't working. Not just low pressure or rusty water, no water at all. I checked all the faucets, the hot water heater, and the main shutoff valve. Everything appeared to be functioning normally, but no water was flowing into the house. I called the well service company that had maintained our system for 20 years. They sent a technician who spent an hour examining the equipment before delivering his diagnosis. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm afraid your well pump has failed completely. It's going to need to be replaced." "How is that possible?" "It was serviced just 6 months ago and working perfectly yesterday." He showed me the pump housing, pointing to what he claimed was evidence of mechanical failure. Sometimes these things just go, especially in older systems. The good news is we can install a new pump, but it's going to take about a week to get the parts, and the installation will run around $8,000. $8,000 and a week without water. For a 70-year-old woman living alone, this was exactly the kind of crisis that Marcus and Jessica had been predicting would force me to accept their help. But I'd learned to be suspicious of convenient timing. "Can I get a second opinion?" I asked. The technician looked uncomfortable. "Well, sure, but any well service company is going to tell you the same thing. When a pump fails like this, replacement is really your only option." I thanked him and said I'd think about it. After he left, I called a well service company from the next county over, one that Marcus and Jessica wouldn't have thought to influence. The new technician arrived that afternoon and spent 20 minutes examining my system before making a discovery that made my blood run cold. "Mrs. Mitchell, your pump didn't fail. Someone deliberately damaged the electrical connections and sabotaged the pressure switch. This wasn't mechanical failure. This was vandalism." He showed me where wires had been cut and components had been deliberately broken. The damage was hidden well enough that a casual inspection might miss it, but clear enough that someone with experience could see it was intentional. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" he asked. I stood in my utility room, looking at the evidence of sabotage, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't just manipulation or pressure tactics anymore. This was criminal destruction of property designed to force me from my home. "I have a pretty good idea," I said quietly. The technician repaired the damage in about an hour and charged me $200. As I wrote the check, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being the victim of their campaign. It was time to fight back. That evening, I called a meeting with Marcus and Jessica. I used my newly restored landline to reach Marcus at home, and I made sure my voice carried just the right note of defeat and desperation. "Marcus, I need you and Jessica to come out here tomorrow. I'm ready to discuss your suggestions about selling the property." I could hear the satisfaction in his voice when he replied, "Of course, Mom. We'll be there first thing in the morning. I think you're making the right decision." They arrived the next day with barely concealed triumph written all over their faces. Jessica carried a leather portfolio that I suspected contained pre-drafted legal documents, and Marcus had the look of someone who'd already mentally spent the money from selling my property. We sat in the living room this time, rather than the kitchen. I wanted them comfortable, confident, ready to reveal exactly what they'd been planning. "I've been thinking about everything you said," I began, letting my voice carry a tremor of uncertainty. "And I have to admit, these past few weeks have been difficult. The internet problems, the phone issues, Tom saying he can't help with maintenance anymore. And then yesterday the well pump failed." "Oh no," Jessica said with perfectly performed concern. "How much is that going to cost to repair?" $8,000, and it could take a week or more to get the parts. Marcus leaned forward with what he probably thought was sympathetic attention. "Mom, this is exactly what we've been worried about. These kinds of unexpected expenses and service interruptions are only going to get worse as the infrastructure ages and you get older." "You're probably right," I said, allowing a sigh to escape. "I'm starting to think I've been foolish, trying to hold on to this place by myself." The look that passed between them was pure predatory satisfaction. They thought they'd won. "So, Jessica said carefully, are you ready to seriously consider our suggestions about finding a more suitable living situation?" "I think so, but I have some questions about the logistics." For the next hour, I let them explain their plan in detail. They'd already researched senior living facilities and had narrowed it down to 3 options, all of which happened to be expensive enough to require selling my property to afford. They'd spoken to real estate agents and had preliminary estimates that the property could sell for between $3.5 and $4.2 million. Marcus had prepared financial projections showing how the proceeds could be invested to provide me with comfortable income for the rest of my life, though I noticed that his calculations assumed he would be managing those investments for a reasonable fee. Jessica had brochures for estate sale companies that could handle disposing of my excess belongings, and she'd already identified which pieces of my furniture and artwork would be suitable for a smaller living space. They had thought of everything. Every detail had been planned. Every obstacle had been anticipated. Every aspect of dismantling my life had been researched and organized. "There's just one thing I'm confused about," I said when they finished their presentation. "What's that?" "Mom? Well, you keep talking about how concerned you are for my safety and well-being, but some of the problems I've been having lately seem convenient for your argument." Marcus looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "I mean, it's interesting that all these service issues started right after our conversation about selling the property. And it's remarkable how Tom suddenly got better job offers that required him to stop working for me. And I'm particularly curious about how my well pump failed in a way that looks suspiciously like sabotage. The color drained from both their faces." "Mom, what are you suggesting?" Marcus asked, but his voice had lost its confident tone. "I'm suggesting that you've been systematically creating the problems you claim to be protecting me from. I'm suggesting that you've been manipulating my service providers, bribing my contractor, and possibly even committing criminal acts to force me into selling my home." Jessica recovered first, her real estate training kicking in. "Rose, that's a very serious accusation. Do you have any proof of these claims?" I smiled at her, the same patient, patronizing smile she'd been giving me for months. "As a matter of fact, I do." I reached into the side table drawer and pulled out a folder containing documentation I'd been gathering for the past week. Photos of the sabotaged well equipment, written statements from the honest technician who'd repaired it, records of the suspicious timing of all my service disruptions, screenshots of online reviews mentioning that my internet service provider had been mysteriously reliable for everyone else in the area. But the most damning piece of evidence was a recording I'd made of my conversation with Tom Bradley's teenage son, who'd felt guilty about his father's sudden change of heart and had confided in me about the conversation between Tom and Marcus. I set the folder on the coffee table between us and watched their faces as they realized how much I knew. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice calm and steady. "You're going to leave my property right now, and you're not going to contact me again unless I specifically invite you to do so. You're going to stop interfering with my service providers, Stop bribing my contractors and stop sabotaging my way. Utilities. Mom, I think you're overreacting, Marcus started to say. I'm not finished, I interrupted, and something in my tone made him stop talking immediately. If I discover any further interference with my life or my property, I'm going to file criminal charges for vandalism, harassment, and conspiracy. I'm also going to file a civil lawsuit for damages and emotional distress. Jessica's face had gone from pale to red. You can't prove anything. And even if you could, we're family. No court is going to— Jessica, I said quietly, you're a real estate agent. You know that property crimes are taken very seriously, especially when they involve elderly victims. You also know that real estate licenses can be revoked for criminal convictions. Are you really willing to risk your career for this? She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. And Marcus, I continued, you work in financial services. How do you think your employer would react to learning that you've been involved in a scheme to defraud an elderly relative? How would your professional reputation survive criminal charges related to elder abuse? Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. Mom, you never meant to get caught, I finished. But you did, and now you're going to live, with the consequences. I stood up and walked to the front door, holding it open for them. I suggest you leave now, before I change my mind about giving you this one opportunity to walk away. They gathered their papers and portfolios with shaking hands, moving like people in a daze. As they reached the door, Marcus turned back to me with tears in his eyes. Mom, I'm sorry. I know we handled this wrong, but we really were trying to help. No, Marcus. You were trying to help yourselves. To my property, to my money, to a lifestyle you felt entitled to but hadn't earned. You saw me as an obstacle to your plans, not as a person deserving of respect. Can we fix this somehow? Can we start over? I looked at this man I'd raised, this person who'd conspired to sabotage my home and force me into exile, and felt something break inside my chest that I knew would never heal completely. I don't know, Marcus. Right now, I need you to leave, so I can decide what kind of relationship, if any, I want to have with people who've shown me that they're willing to commit crimes to get what they want from me. They left without another word, and I watched their car disappear down my driveway before closing and locking the door. I stood in my living room, the room where Frank and I had celebrated birthdays and holidays, where we'd read books by the fireplace on winter evenings, where we'd made plans and shared dreams for 45 years, and realized that everything had changed. My son and daughter-in-law had shown me exactly who they were when they thought I was helpless. They'd revealed the depths of their greed and the lengths they were willing to go to get what they wanted. But they'd also made a critical mistake. They'd underestimated not just my resolve, but my resources. They thought they were dealing with a helpless old woman who could be manipulated and bullied into submission. They had no idea what I was actually capable of, and they were about to find out. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a legal pad, making lists. Not lists of things to pack or places to live, lists of phone numbers to call, strategies to implement, and consequences to arrange. Because Marcus and Jessica weren't the only ones who could play games with utilities and services. They weren't the only ones who understood how to use professional networks and bureaucratic leverage. The difference was, I had 45 years of community connections, business relationships, and accumulated goodwill that they couldn't even imagine. I had resources they didn't know about, allies they'd never considered, and options they couldn't predict. Most importantly, I had something they'd never had, the moral authority that comes from being in the right. They'd declared war on a harmless, old woman who just wanted to live peacefully in her own home. They were about to discover that this harmless old woman was neither harmless nor defenseless, and the consequences of their actions were going to be more devastating than they could possibly imagine. After Marcus and Jessica left that day, I expected them to retreat and lick their wounds, maybe regroup and try a different approach, or perhaps even accept that their scheme had failed and leave me alone. I should have known better. Desperate people don't give up easily, especially when they can smell millions of dollars slipping through their fingers. What happened next was both predictable and shocking in its audacity. 3 days after I'd confronted them with evidence of their sabotage campaign, Marcus called me with a voice full of what sounded like genuine remorse and concern. "Mom, I've been doing a lot of thinking since our conversation, and I owe you a huge apology. Jessica and I got carried away with our concerns for your safety, and we handled everything completely wrong." I listened silently, curious to see where this new strategy was heading. I realize now that we were being controlling and disrespectful. "You're a strong, capable woman who has every right to make her own decisions about her life and her property. We should have trusted your judgment, instead of trying to manipulate the situation." The apology sounded rehearsed, but there was enough sincerity in his voice to make me wonder if he'd actually had a genuine change of heart. Maybe the shock of being caught had forced him to confront what they'd been doing. "I appreciate you saying that, Marcus," I said carefully. "Mom, I want to make this right. I want to prove to you that we can respect your choices and support you in living the life you want to live. What did you have in mind?" "Well, instead of pressuring you to sell the property, what if we helped you stay? What if Jessica and I moved onto the property to help you manage everything? We could renovate the old farmhand cottage and live there, so you'd have family nearby without giving up your independence." The farmhand cottage was a small 2-bedroom structure about a quarter-mile from the main house, built in the 1920s when the property had been a working dairy farm. Frank and I had used it for storage and as a workshop space, but it could potentially be converted into a living space with some work. "You want to move onto my property?" I asked. "Just to help, Mom. You could keep running the B&B exactly as you have been. Maintain your independence completely, but we'd be nearby if you needed anything. And we could help with the property maintenance, the business operations, whatever you needed." It was a clever pivot. Instead of trying to force me off the property, they were proposing to move onto it. They'd still have access to what they wanted: proximity to the valuable land, involvement in the business operations, and positioning for eventual inheritance. But they'd frame it as helping me rather than controlling me. What would Jessica think about giving up your house in town? To live in a cottage on my property? Actually, it was her idea. She feels terrible about how we handled things, and she wants to make amends. She thinks living here could be good for the kids too. They'd have more space, better access to nature, and a closer relationship with their grandmother. I had to admit the offer was tempting. The isolation that Marcus and Jessica had artificially created over the past month had reminded me how much I'd enjoyed having family around when the kids were younger, and having help with property maintenance would genuinely be useful, especially as I got older. But I was also deeply suspicious of this sudden transformation from manipulation to selfless assistance. "I'd need to think about it," I said. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But Mom, I want you to know that this offer comes with no strings attached. The property would remain entirely yours. You'd make all the decisions about how it's managed, and we'd just be there to help however you wanted us to help." After we hung up, I sat in my garden thinking about the proposal. On the surface, it seemed like exactly what any grandmother would want: family nearby, help with the work, and grandchildren growing up on the beautiful property their great-grandparents had built. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just a more sophisticated version of the same scheme. Over the next week, Marcus and Jessica launched a charm offensive that was impressive in its thoroughness and persistence. They visited every other day, bringing flowers, homemade meals, and detailed plans for renovating the cottage. They were respectful, deferential, and seemingly committed to supporting my decisions rather than overriding them. Jessica, in particular, seemed like a completely different person. Gone was the calculating real estate agent who'd been pressuring me to sell. In her place was a warm, family-oriented woman who spoke enthusiastically about vegetable gardens, homeschooling possibilities for the kids, and community-building projects we could work on together. "Rose, I've been researching sustainable farming practices," she said during one visit, spreading out printed articles and planning documents on my kitchen table. "I think we could really expand the organic operation here. Maybe add some heritage breed livestock, start a farm-to-table restaurant component to complement the B&B. She'd done impressive research. Her proposals were well thought out, financially, sound, and genuinely exciting. The idea of expanding the property's agricultural operations had always appealed to me, but Frank and I had never had the time or energy to pursue it seriously. The kids are so excited about the possibility of living here," Marcus added. "Emma's been talking about learning to ride horses, and Jake wants to help with the chicken coop. They're both old enough now to really appreciate what you and Dad built here." Emma was 16 and Jake was 14, ages when most teenagers were more interested in video games and social media than farm life. But when they visited with their parents, they did seem genuinely enthusiastic about the property. Emma asked thoughtful questions about the gardens and talked about art projects inspired by the natural beauty. Jake was fascinated by the mechanical aspects of the B&B operations and the property maintenance equipment. The family dinners we shared during this courtship period were some of the most pleasant times I'd spent with Marcus and Jessica since Frank's death. The conversation was easy. The kids were engaged and respectful, and for brief moments I could almost forget the manipulation and sabotage of the previous months. But I was 70 years old, not 17. I'd seen enough of life to recognize when people were telling me what they thought I wanted to hear. So I did what any sensible woman in my position would do. I hired a private investigator. I'd never hired a PI before, but I figured if Marcus and Jessica could play dirty, so could I. I found a reputable firm through my lawyer and asked them to conduct a thorough background check on my son and daughter-in-law's financial situation. What they discovered was illuminating. Marcus and Jessica were in serious financial trouble, much more serious than I'd realized. Jessica's real estate career had hit a rough patch over the past 2 years, with several major deals falling through and her commission income dropping by nearly 60%. Marcus's financial planning business was struggling in the competitive market, and he'd made some poor investment decisions with their personal savings. They were 3 months behind on their mortgage payments and facing foreclosure proceedings. Their credit card debt was substantial, over $85,000 across multiple cards, all maxed out. Jessica's BMW had been repossessed 2 months earlier, though they'd managed to keep that information from becoming public. Marcus's retirement accounts had been cashed out to pay for immediate expenses, leaving them with no long-term financial security. Most damning of all, they'd taken out a second mortgage on their house 18 months earlier, right around the time Frank died. The loan documents listed family property inheritance as a planned source of repayment. They'd been planning to inherit my property since the day Frank was buried. The cottage renovation plan wasn't about helping me or being closer to family. It was about positioning themselves on the property so they could gradually take control of operations, isolate me from outside support, and eventually force the sale they'd been planning all along. Living on site would give them daily access to my business records, my personal affairs, and opportunities to create new crises that would require their intervention. But the most disturbing part of the investigator's report was the discovery that Jessica had already been in contact with several development companies about the potential sale of my property. She'd provided detailed property descriptions, aerial photographs, and preliminary assessments of development potential. She'd even received initial offers ranging from $4.2 million to $5.8 million, depending on zoning approvals and subdivision possibilities. They'd been shopping my property while pretending to help me keep it. Armed with this information, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting them immediately, I decided to let them proceed with their plan. I would agree to the cottage arrangement, let them move onto the property, and give them just enough rope to hang themselves. Because I had my own plan now. And unlike theirs, mine was going to work. When Marcus called to check on my decision about their proposal, I surprised him with enthusiastic acceptance. I've been thinking about what you said, and I think it's a wonderful idea. Having family nearby would be a blessing, and I could really use help expanding the agricultural operations. The relief in his voice was palpable. Mom, that's fantastic. We're so excited to make this work. I do have one condition, though. Of course. What is it? I want everything formalized in writing. A lease agreement for the cottage, clear boundaries, about responsibilities and decision-making authority, that sort of thing. I've learned that even family arrangements work better when expectations are clearly defined. Absolutely. Jessica actually suggested the same thing. We want everything to be transparent and fair. I'll bet she did. Jessica would want legal documents, because she was planning to use them to establish residency rights, business partnership claims, and eventually, inheritance arguments. What she didn't realize was that I was planning to use those same documents to protect myself from exactly those kinds of manipulations. Over the next month, we negotiated a comprehensive agreement that covered every aspect of their residency. On my property, I insisted on involving lawyers, my lawyer for my interests and their lawyer for theirs. I wanted everything documented, witnessed, and legally binding. The final agreement was a masterpiece of protective language that Jessica's lawyer either didn't fully understand or thought he could work around later. The cottage lease was month to month, with a 30-day termination clause that could be exercised by either party for any reason. Marcus and Jessica would pay market rate rent for the cottage, utilities, and shared access to property amenities. They could help with property maintenance and B&B operations, but only under my direct supervision and at my discretion. Most importantly, the agreement explicitly stated that their residency created no ownership rights, business partnership claims, or inheritance expectations. They would be tenants, not partners, and their presence on the property was entirely at my pleasure. Jessica signed the documents with a smile, probably thinking she was outsmarting a naive old woman who didn't understand legal complexities. What she didn't realize was that I'd been running a small business for 20 years and had learned to protect myself with ironclad contracts. Marcus and Jessica moved into the cottage on a crisp October morning, bringing only the belongings they'd managed to save before losing their house to foreclosure. They'd told me they were downsizing by choice to embrace a simpler lifestyle. But I knew the truth. They'd lost everything and were counting on my property to rebuild their lives. The first few weeks of the arrangement were everything they'd promised. They were helpful, respectful, and genuinely useful around the property. Marcus proved to be handy with repairs and maintenance tasks. Jessica threw herself into expanding the B&B marketing and developing new revenue streams. The kids seemed to genuinely enjoy the rural lifestyle and were surprisingly helpful with daily chores. I almost started to believe that maybe they'd learned from their mistakes and were sincerely committed to making this new arrangement work for everyone. I should have known better. The problems started small, the way they always do. Jessica began making minor changes to the B&B operations without consulting me first. She rearranged the guest room furniture to create better flow, updated the online booking descriptions to emphasize amenities I'd never offered, and started advertising extended stay packages that required commitments I wasn't comfortable making. When I questioned these changes, she had perfectly reasonable explanations. The furniture arrangement was more professional looking. The updated descriptions would attract higher-paying guests. The extended stay packages would provide more predictable income. All of her justifications were logical, but they missed the fundamental point. She was making decisions about my business without asking my permission. Marcus started similar boundary pushing, with the property maintenance. He hired contractors for projects I hadn't approved, ordered equipment I hadn't requested, and made structural changes to outbuildings without consulting me. When I objected, He explained that he was just trying to be proactive, to handle necessary improvements so I wouldn't have to worry about them. But I wanted to worry about them. They were my buildings, my property, my decisions to make. The most troubling changes involved my relationships with long-term guests and local business partners. Jessica began fielding phone calls intended for me, making commitments on my behalf, and gradually positioning herself as the primary contact for B&B operations. When regular guests called to make reservations, they increasingly spoke with Jessica instead of me. When suppliers delivered goods or performed services, they began checking with Jessica for approval and payment. I was being systematically removed from the management of my own business. The shift was subtle enough that most people probably didn't notice it happening. Jessica was friendly and professional with everyone, and she handled things competently. But the result was that I was becoming a figurehead in my own operation while she assumed the role of actual manager. When I tried to address these issues directly, both Marcus and Jessica became defensive and hurt. "Mom, I thought you wanted our help," Marcus said when I confronted him about the unauthorized contractor work. "I was trying to take care of things so you wouldn't have to deal with the stress and hassle." "Rose, I'm just trying to make the business more efficient and profitable," Jessica added when I questioned her booking policy changes. "I thought you'd appreciate having someone handle the day-to-day operations, so you could focus on the parts you enjoy most." They were using my own desire for help against me, making me feel ungrateful for objecting to their increasingly controlling behavior. It was a sophisticated form of gaslighting that made me question whether I was being unreasonably suspicious or appropriately cautious. But the moment that crystallized everything happened 6 weeks after they'd moved into the cottage. I woke up one morning to discover that Jessica had rearranged my entire kitchen, not just moved a few things around for better efficiency, completely reorganized everything. Dishes, pots, utensils, pantry items, spices, everything had been relocated according to her ideas about optimal kitchen organization. When I came downstairs to make my morning coffee, I couldn't find anything in my own kitchen. The coffee was in a different cabinet. The mugs were in a different location. Even the coffee maker had been moved to what Jessica apparently considered a better spot. I stood in the middle of the kitchen where Frank and I had shared thousands of meals, where I'd cooked for B&B guests for 20 years, where I'd preserved countless harvests from our gardens and felt like a stranger in my own home. "Jessica," I called, trying to keep my voice calm. She appeared from the living room, wearing an apron that used to be mine and looking pleased with herself. "Good morning, Rose. I hope you don't mind, but I got up early and reorganized the kitchen for better workflow. It's much more efficient now. Everything's grouped by function and frequency of use. You're going to love how much easier cooking will be." I stared at her, trying to process the audacity of someone rearranging another person's kitchen without permission. "You moved everything in my kitchen." "I optimized everything in your kitchen," she corrected with a bright smile. "Trust me, once you get used to the new system, you'll wonder how you ever managed with the old setup." "Jessica, this is my kitchen, in my house. These are my belongings, arranged the way I want them arranged." Her smile faltered slightly. "Rose, I was just trying to help. I have a lot of experience with kitchen design from my real estate work, and I could see how much more functional this space could be with better organization. I didn't ask for your help with my kitchen organization. Well, no, but I thought it would be a nice surprise, a way to contribute to making the household run more smoothly." The word household hit me like a slap. She wasn't talking about helping with my house. She was talking about managing our shared household. She'd mentally moved from tenant to co-owner, from helper to manager, from guest to resident, with equal rights. "Jessica, I want you to put everything back exactly the way it was." "Rose, just give it a chance. Once you see how much better, I want you to put everything back exactly the way it was right now." She looked at me like I was being unreasonable, like I was rejecting a generous gift out of stubbornness. But she began moving things back to their original locations, muttering under her breath about how some people were resistant to positive changes. As I watched her restore my kitchen to my preferred arrangement, I realized that this had been a test. Jessica had been gradually pushing boundaries for weeks, seeing how much control she could assume before I pushed back. The kitchen reorganization was her way of finding out whether I still considered myself the authority in my own home. I'd passed her test by asserting my boundaries, but in doing so, I'd also failed her test by proving that I wasn't going to be as easy to manipulate as she'd hoped. That afternoon, I made a decision that had been building for weeks. It was time for Marcus and Jessica to go. But I wasn't going, to simply evict them and return to the status quo. Oh no. They'd shown me exactly who they were, what they were capable of, and what they were planning. They demonstrated that they saw my property as their inheritance and my life as an obstacle to their plans. They'd pushed a 70-year-old woman to the breaking point with their greed and manipulation, and now they were going to learn what happened when you underestimated someone who'd spent 70 years accumulating wisdom, resources, and the kind of patience that comes from knowing exactly how to wait for the perfect moment to strike back. The eviction would be just the beginning. What came next would teach them that actions have consequences, that betraying family trust has a price, and that sometimes the people you think are powerless are actually the most dangerous opponents you could possibly choose. But first, I had to get them off my property. And I had exactly the right plan to make that happen in the most memorable way possible. But first, I had to get them off my property. And I had exactly the right plan to make that happen in the most memorable way possible. The irony of what I was about to do wasn't lost on me. Marcus and Jessica had spent months trying to force me out of my own home, using manipulation, sabotage, and psychological pressure to make me believe I couldn't handle living independently. Now I was going to show them what real power looked like when wielded by someone who actually owned what they were fighting over. But before I reveal how this all played out, let me tell you about the phone call that changed everything. A call I received exactly 1 week after the kitchen reorganization incident that had finally opened my eyes to their true intentions. I was sitting in my garden on a beautiful November morning, sipping coffee and watching the last of the autumn leaves drift down from the oak trees when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer anyway. Mrs. Mitchell? This is James Whitfield from Whitfield & Associates Property Development. I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time. I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong number. I'm not interested in selling my property. Actually, Mrs. Mitchell, I'm calling because we've already received some preliminary information about your property from Jessica Carter. She indicated that you might be interested in exploring development options for your 15-acre parcel. My blood went cold. Jessica Carter contacted you about my property? Yes, ma'am. She provided us with aerial photographs, property surveys, and some initial assessments about subdivision potential. We're very interested in making an offer, and Jessica suggested that this might be a good time to begin formal discussions. Set down my coffee cup with a hand that had started trembling with rage. Mr. Whitfield, Jessica Carter is my daughter-in-law, and she has absolutely no authority to discuss my property with anyone. She doesn't own this land. She has no legal right to represent my interests, and I have never authorized her to contact developers on my behalf. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I see. I'm very sorry, Mrs. Mitchell. Jessica led us to believe that she was acting with your full knowledge and consent. She mentioned that you were elderly and that she was helping to manage your affairs. She told you I was elderly and needed help managing my affairs? Well, yes. She said that you'd been having some health issues and that the family was helping you make important decisions about your future. The audacity of it took my breath away. Jessica had been presenting herself to developers as my caretaker or legal representative, implying that I was incompetent to manage my own affairs. She'd been shopping my property around while living in my cottage, eating my food, and pretending to be a devoted daughter-in-law who just wanted to help. Mr. Whitfield, I'm 70 years old, but I'm in excellent health and completely capable of managing my own affairs. I have not authorized anyone to represent me in property matters, and I am not interested in selling or developing my land. I understand completely, Mrs. Mitchell. Again, I apologize for any confusion. We'll remove your property from our development prospects immediately. Before you hang up, can you tell me what kind of offer you were prepared to make? Well, based on the preliminary assessment, we were looking at somewhere in the range of 5.2 to 5.8 million, depending on zoning approvals and environmental studies. Nearly $6 million. Jessica had been negotiating the sale of my property for almost $6 million, without my knowledge or consent, while living on that same property as my supposed helper and supporter. After I hung up, I sat in my garden for a long time, trying to process the full scope of their betrayal. It wasn't just that they wanted me to sell the property. They'd been actively working to sell it behind my back, using their residency on the land to gather information and establish credibility with developers. But Mr. Whitfield's call had given me something even more valuable than information about their treachery. It had given me the perfect weapon to use against them, because while Jessica had been busy presenting herself as my representative to developers, she'd been creating a paper trail of fraud, misrepresentation, and possibly elder abuse. And I had witnesses, documentation, and evidence of everything she'd done. It was time to end this charade once and for all. That afternoon, I made 3 phone calls that would set my plan in motion. The first call was to my lawyer, Richard Morrison, who'd been handling my legal affairs for 15 years. I explained the entire situation, the manipulation campaign, the sabotage, the cottage arrangement, and Jessica's unauthorized contact with developers. Rose, this is serious. What Jessica's been doing could constitute fraud, elder abuse, and possibly criminal impersonation. You have grounds for both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit. I don't want to sue them, Richard. I just want them off my property and out of my life. But I want to make sure they can never try something like this again. What did you have in mind? I explained my plan, and after a long pause, Richard chuckled. Rose, that's either brilliant or completely crazy, possibly both. Are you sure you want to go this route instead of just having them arrested? I'm sure. Sometimes the best justice is the kind that teaches people exactly what they've lost through their own greed. The second call was to a real estate agent, not one of Jessica's colleagues, but a highly respected broker from the next county who specialized in luxury properties and land sales. Mrs. Mitchell, I'd be honored to handle the sale of your property. Based on your description and the current market, I think we could list it for $5.5 million and expect to get close to asking price, possibly more if we get multiple offers. How quickly could we complete a sale? For a property of this caliber, with the right buyer, we could close in 30 to 45 days. Cash buyers could move even faster. Perfect. I'll call you back with instructions on when to proceed. The third call was to a moving company that specialized in estate relocations. We can have a crew there within 48 hours of your call, Mrs. Mitchell. For a property of that size, we'd recommend a 3-day packing and loading schedule. Where will you be relocating to? I'll let you know the destination address when I call to schedule. For now, I just need to know you can move quickly when the time comes. With my support team in place, I spent the rest of the week implementing the final phase of my plan. I quietly packed my most precious belongings, family photos, Frank's personal items, my grandmother's china, important documents, and stored them in a climate-controlled unit in town. To anyone watching, it would look like I was just doing some organization and decluttering. I also made arrangements for the B&B guests who had reservations over the next 2 months. I contacted each party personally, explained that I was making some changes to the property, and helped them find alternative accommodations. Most were understanding, and several mentioned that they'd noticed some inconsistencies in recent communications that had made them wonder if something was changing. Jessica had apparently been promising amenities and services that I'd never offered, creating exactly the kind of customer service problems that I'd spent 20 years avoiding. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the developer's phone call, I was ready to spring my trap. Marcus and Jessica were in the cottage, having breakfast when I knocked on their door. They seemed surprised to see me so early, but invited me in with their usual pretense of warmth and hospitality. "Rose, good morning. You're up early today. Would you like some coffee?" Jessica asked, gesturing toward the kitchen that had once been my storage space and was now decorated with my dishes and furniture that they'd borrowed from the main house. "No, thank you. I wanted to talk to both of you about something important." They exchanged one of their looks, the same kind of wordless communication that had been excluding me from conversations in my own home for months. "Of course," Marcus said. "What's on your mind?" "I received an interesting phone call yesterday from a property developer named James Whitfield." Jessica's face went completely white, but she tried to maintain her composure. "Oh? What did he want?" "He wanted to discuss an offer for my property. Apparently, someone named Jessica Carter had been providing him with detailed information about my land and had suggested that I might be interested in selling." Marcus looked confused, but Jessica was clearly calculating her response. "Rose, I can explain that. I was just doing some preliminary research to understand the property's value, in case you ever did decide to consider selling. I wasn't making any commitments on your behalf." "Really?" "Because Mr. Whitfield seemed to think you were representing me in some official capacity. He mentioned that you'd told him I was elderly and having health issues, and that the family was helping me make important decisions." "I never said you were incompetent." "No, but you did tell him I was elderly and needed help managing my affairs. You presented yourself as my representative without my knowledge or consent. You provided confidential information about my property to a third party for the purpose of soliciting offers to purchase." Marcus was beginning to understand the seriousness of the situation. "Mom, if there was some miscommunication..." "There was no miscommunication, Marcus. There was deliberate deception. Jessica has been shopping my property to developers while living on that property as my tenant and pretending to be my supportive daughter-in-law." I pulled out a folder containing printed emails, phone records, and documentation that my lawyer had helped me prepare. I have evidence of multiple contacts between Jessica and various development companies. I have records of information sharing that violates our lease agreement and potentially constitutes fraud. And I have witness statements about Jessica's misrepresentation of her authority to act on my behalf. Jessica had gone from white to red, and I could see anger replacing her fear. "Rose, you're blowing this completely out of proportion. I was just trying to help you understand your options. By going behind my back to developers? By telling them I was incompetent? By promising them access to detailed property information without my consent? I never promised them anything. I was just gathering information." "Jessica, you told Mr. Whitfield that this might be a good time to begin formal discussions. That sounds like more than information gathering to me." Marcus tried to intervene. "Mom, I'm sure we can work this out. Maybe there was some misunderstanding about boundaries." "The only misunderstanding was mine, Marcus. I misunderstood your motivations for wanting to live on my property. I thought you wanted to help me, but you actually wanted to position yourselves to take control of my assets." I stood up and pulled out a document that my lawyer had prepared. "This is a 30-day notice to vacate the cottage. You have 30 days from today to remove yourselves and all your belongings from my property." Jessica shot to her feet. "You can't evict us. We have a lease." "Yes, you do. A month-to-month lease that either party can terminate with 30 days' notice. I'm exercising that option." "Rose, please," Marcus said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "Let's talk about this rationally. We can work out whatever problems you think exist." The problem, Marcus, is that you and your wife have shown me exactly who you are. You've shown me that you see my property as your inheritance, my life as an inconvenience, and my trust as something to be exploited. That's not true. It is true. You sabotaged my utilities to create crises that would force me to depend on you. You bribed my contractors to abandon me so I'd feel helpless. You manufactured every problem you claimed to be protecting me from. Jessica's composure finally cracked completely. Fine. You want to know the truth? Yes. We need this property. Yes, we're in financial trouble. Yes, we've been planning for you to sell it. But that doesn't make us criminals, Rose. It makes us practical. And what about contacting developers behind my back? What about it? You're 70 years old, Rose. How much longer are you realistically going to be able to manage this place? We were just trying to be prepared for the inevitable. The inevitable? Your death, Rose, or your incapacity, or some crisis that forces you to accept reality about what you can and can't handle at your age. The naked honesty of it was breathtaking. She'd finally admitted what I'd suspected all along. They weren't trying to help me. They were waiting for me to die, or become incompetent so they could inherit my property. Well, Jessica, I'm afraid you're going to have to find another plan, because I'm not dying. I'm not becoming incapacitated, and I'm not selling my property to fund your lifestyle. So what? You're just going to live here alone forever? You're going to die a bitter old woman in this house, clinging to memories of a dead husband and refusing to let your family build a future? Marcus looked horrified. Jessica, don't. But she was past caring about maintaining pretenses. No, Marcus, I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of tiptoeing around her feelings and acting like this situation is sustainable. Rose is being selfish and unrealistic, and someone needs to tell her the truth. I looked at this woman who'd been living in my cottage, eating food grown in my gardens, and planning to sell my property out from under me, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. You're right, Jessica. Someone does need to tell the truth. So let me tell you some truths you might find interesting. I sat back down and opened another folder I'd brought with me. Truth number 1. I know about your foreclosure. I know you lost your house because you couldn't make the mortgage payments. I know about Jessica's repossessed car and Marcus's cashed out retirement accounts. Their faces went ashen. Truth number 2. I know you took out a second mortgage 18 months ago listing family property inheritance as your planned source of repayment. You've been banking on my death since the day Frank was buried. Mom, how did you? Truth number 3. I know that Jessica has been contacting multiple developers, not just Mr. Whitfield. I have records of at least 6 different companies. She's approached with information about my property. Jessica slumped back into her chair, the fight going out of her. And here's the final truth, I continued. Everything you've been trying to force me to do, selling this property and moving to a senior community, I'm going to do voluntarily, but not because you manipulated me into it, and not for your benefit. They both stared at me in confusion. I'm listing this property for sale next week. I expect to have a buyer within 30 days and close within 60 days. I'm moving to a luxury senior community in Florida that I've already selected and put a deposit on. But why? Marcus stammered. Because watching you two these past months has made me realize something important. This property was special when Frank and I shared it together. It was our dream, our refuge, our life's work. But Frank is gone, and trying to preserve our life here without him has become more about holding on to the past than building a future. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens that Frank and I had planted together 45 years earlier. I don't want to spend my remaining years fighting with family members who see me as an obstacle to their financial plans. I don't want to live in fear of the next manipulation campaign or sabotage attempt. and I don't want to leave a legacy of bitterness and greed for my grandchildren to inherit. So, you're just going to sell everything? Give up on the family legacy Dad worked so hard to build? Marcus's voice was filled with genuine anguish. Marcus, your father and I built this place as a home for our family, but you've shown me that you don't want a family home. You want a commodity to sell. You don't want to preserve what we built. You want to profit from it. I turned back to face them both. So I'm going to sell it to someone who will appreciate it and preserve it. And I'm going to use the money to build the life I want for my remaining years without having to worry about family members who see my property as their retirement plan. What about us? Jessica asked quietly. What about the kids' future? This property could have set them up for life. The kids will be fine, Jessica. They have 2 working parents who can provide for them through their own efforts, just like every other family in America. They don't need an inheritance to have a good life. They need parents who teach them the value of hard work and honest living. I picked up my folders and headed toward the door. You have 30 days to vacate the cottage. After that, if you're still here, I'll have you removed by the sheriff and pursue criminal charges for trespassing. Mom, wait, Marcus called after me. Can we talk about this? Can we work something out? I paused at the door and looked back at my son. This man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, who'd repaid that love by trying to steal my home and manipulate my final years. Marcus, you told me to figure out my own life. Congratulations, I'm taking your advice. I walked out of the cottage and back to my house, feeling lighter than I had in months, but that conversation was just the beginning of the most satisfying week of my life. 3 days later, the for sale sign went up in my front yard. Not a small, discreet sign, but a large professional display with color photos and premium marketing materials. I made sure it was visible from the cottage so Marcus and Jessica would see it every time they looked out their window. The listing price was $5.8 million. Within 48 hours, I had 3 serious inquiries and 1 cash offer for full asking price. The cash offer came from a family with young children who wanted to continue operating the B&B while raising their kids on the property. They loved the gardens, appreciated the agricultural potential, and understood the historical significance of the farmhouse. They were exactly the kind of family that Frank and I would have wanted to pass our legacy to. I accepted their offer immediately. While the sale was being processed, I had the moving company come to pack my belongings. I stood in my driveway, directing the movers as they loaded boxes and furniture into trucks, very aware that Marcus and Jessica were watching from their cottage window. But the most satisfying moment came when the buyers arrived for their final walkthrough before closing. The Peterson family, husband, wife, and 3 children ranging from 8 to 15, fell in love with the property exactly as Frank and I had 45 years earlier. They walked through the gardens exclaiming over the beauty, discussed plans for expanding the agricultural operations, and talked excitedly about hosting family gatherings in the farmhouse. Mrs. Peterson mentioned that they'd been looking for exactly this kind of property for years, somewhere they could build a multi-generational family compound while operating a sustainable business. We want our children to grow up understanding where food comes from, learning the value of hard work, and appreciating the natural world, she explained as we toured the vegetable gardens. This place is perfect for that. As I watched the Peterson children explore the same gardens where Marcus had played as a boy, I felt a sense of peace and closure that I hadn't expected. This property would continue to be loved and cared for by a family who truly appreciated what it represented. That evening, as I was putting the finishing touches on my packing, Marcus appeared at my kitchen door. He looked haggard and defeated, but I could also see something in his eyes that might have been genuine remorse. "Mom, can we talk?" I let him in and offered him coffee, which he accepted gratefully. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "Not just for the things we did, but for the way we've been thinking about you and this property. You were right. We stopped seeing this as your home and started seeing it as our inheritance." "I appreciate you saying that, Marcus. I want you to know that I'm ashamed of what we put you through. The sabotage, the manipulation, the way we tried to make you feel helpless, none of that was okay. And Jessica's contact with the developers was completely out of line. What made you realize that? He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. Watching the Peterson family today, seeing how excited they were about the property, how they appreciated everything you and Dad built here. It made me realize that we'd never looked at this place that way. How did you look at it? Like a windfall, like something we were entitled to instead of something we should earn. And I think we resented having to wait for it. The honesty of his admission was painful, but necessary. Marcus, do you understand why I'm selling to them instead of keeping the property in the family? Because we proved we don't deserve it. Because you proved you don't want it. Not really. You want the money it represents, but you don't want the responsibility, the work, the commitment to preserving what Frank and I built here. He nodded sadly. You're right. And I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry we let greed turn us into people who would hurt you to get what we wanted. What are you going to do now? I don't know. Find jobs, I guess. Start over. Try to rebuild our lives through our own efforts instead of waiting for someone else's inheritance. That sounds like a good plan. Mom, is there any chance? Is there any way we could have a relationship again someday? I know we've lost your trust, and I know we've hurt you in ways that might not be forgivable. But you're my mother, and despite everything, I love you. I looked at this man I'd raised, who disappointed me so profoundly but who seemed to be genuinely recognizing his mistakes. And I thought about the years I had left, and whether I wanted to spend them nursing grievances or trying to rebuild damaged relationships. Marcus, I'm moving to Florida next month. I'm starting a new life in a place where I can make new friends, pursue new interests, and live without worrying about family politics or property management. His face fell, and I could see him preparing for another rejection. But, I continued, if you and Jessica and the kids want to visit me there, if you want to try building a relationship based on respect instead of financial expectations, I'd be open to that. Really? Really. But it would have to be a completely different kind of relationship. I would be Rose, your mother, not Rose, the property owner. You would be my son who visits because he enjoys my company, not because he wants something from me. I'd like that, Mom. I'd like that very much. Then we'll see what happens. The closing on the property sale took place on a Friday morning in December. I signed the papers, handed over the keys, and walked away with a certified check for $5.8 million. Marcus and Jessica had moved out of the cottage the week before, taking their few belongings and moving into a rental apartment in town. They'd IB.T. Both found jobs, Marcus with a local accounting firm, Jessica with a small real estate office, and they were slowly beginning the process of rebuilding their financial lives through their own efforts. The last thing I did before leaving town was drive past the property one final time. The Peterson family was already moving in, and I could see their children playing in the yard where Marcus had played 30 years earlier. Mrs. Peterson waved, from the front porch where she was directing movers, and I waved back, feeling confident that I'd made the right choice. That afternoon, I drove away from the only home I'd ever known, heading south toward my new life in Florida. 6 months later, I'm writing this story from the sunroom of my luxury apartment in a premier senior community just outside Naples. I have my own space again, new friends who share my interests, and a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. The community has extensive gardens where I can grow vegetables and flowers, a workshop where I'm learning pottery, and social activities that keep me engaged and active. I've joined a book club, started taking photography classes, and even begun dating a lovely gentleman named Robert who shares my love of travel. Marcus and the family visited me for Thanksgiving, and it was the most pleasant time we'd spent together in years. Without the property and inheritance issues hanging over our relationship, we were able to simply enjoy each other's company. The kids are thriving, Emma is excelling in art school, and Jake has discovered a talent for mechanical engineering. Jessica and I will probably never be close, but we've found a way to be cordial and respectful. She seems genuinely committed to rebuilding their life through honest work rather than waiting for windfalls. Most importantly, I wake up every morning in a place that's entirely mine, surrounded by things I chose because I love them, with no one questioning my decisions or waiting for me to die so they can inherit my belongings. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is refuse to enable their worst impulses. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give your children is the opportunity to build their own lives instead of waiting for yours to end. And sometimes the best way to honor the life you built with someone you loved is to let it go gracefully and create something new for the time you have left. Frank would understand. He always said that home isn't a place. It's the people you love and the life you build together. I'm building a new life now, and it's beautiful. As for that shed, they told me to stay in? Well, it turned out I didn't need to stay anywhere I didn't want to be. Because when you own the property, you make the rules. And I made the best rule of all. I chose happiness over holding grudges, freedom over family politics, and my own peace of mind over everyone else's expectations. That's a lesson worth $6 million any day. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.